My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, we go for the jugular in Forged in Steel and Baptism by Fire.
Our first segment is the basic crawl.
Forged in Steel is the sample chronicle setting, and Baptism by Fire, its accompanying scenario, that was included in Vampire the Masquerade 1st and 2nd edition. We are working for this podcast from the 2nd edition, published by White Wolf Game Studio in 1997. And the bit we're talking about appears on pages 240 to 263 of that book. Vampire the Masquerade was written by Mark Reinhagen, Graham Davis, Tom Dowd, Lisa Stevens, and Stuart Week, and the Forged in Steel Chronicle was created by Mark Reinhagen, although it's not totally clear who did the write-up in the published book. The artwork in this part of the book includes pieces by Tim Bradstreet, Max Shade Fellwalker, Dan Smith, Joshua Gabriel Timbrook, and Kevin Meyer Jr., and I think one more that I haven't been able to identify, so congratulations to whoever that was. Okay, let's get on with the contents. Now, Forged in Steel is the background and the setup for the Chronicle, and it begins with concepts and premise, talking about the general tone of what this Chronicle, basically the campaign, should be, the keywords being intrigue, betrayal, and decadence. And this actually describes the sort of ideation and note-taking process that Mark Reinhagen went through at this point to create the basic ideas. Then we get a couple of pages on the setting, which is Gary, Indiana, a Rust Belt town that has the following landmark neighborhoods that are highlighted here. The Wasteland, a kind of decaying industrial area. Dockyards, Gary Exports Company, which smuggles drugs, guns, and occasionally vampires. And the Auction, in which a ghoul sells humans for blood in exchange for vampire blood. That's kind of a Vampire the Masquerade setting detail, but it makes sense in context. Then we get a bit of description of some characters and 5 what's described as contacts. Really, this is sort of 5 ways to set up an existing relationship between a PC and some of the major NPCs that show up later before you begin playing. And then the text talks about antagonists, the overall plan of things that should happen or unfold, and finally about the motif of the Chronicle, which is decay. Next, we get the cast of characters. Each of the following NPCs gets roughly a single 2-column page. So one column is a black and white line art portrait and a miniature character sheet, and then they get more or less a full page 1 column of description. And those characters are Modius, the Prince of Gary, Indiana, a cruel and cowardly man. Alicia, his vampiric child, who never speaks. Then there is Juggler, the rebel, who has some kind of hold over the prince, though it's never really clear what that blackmail might be. Then there is Michael, a lonely childlike vampire who lairs in the cemetery. Evelyn, the new kid who is intoxicated by her newborn vampiric abilities. There is Alexander Danov, a hideous creature in search of the state called Golconda, in which vampires are free from the need to drink blood. We also meet Lucian, a gruff elder vampire who's around 2,000 years old. And some humans. There is Sullivan Dane, a former Jesuit, now vampire hunter with the power of true faith. Special Agent William Shepard, an FBI agent who knows vampires exist. And Detective Gregory Stevens, a Chicago homicide cop who wants to help his sister, the previously mentioned new vampire, Evelyn.
Then we get to Baptism by Fire, which is the scenario portion of the Chronicle. This scenario is essentially organized around a number of key events, and these events all take place during a New Year's party being hosted by Prince Modius. And so the player characters are invited to this party because basically it's all the vampires of Gary who are there. Those key events are Alicia invites a player character to exchange blood. It's a show of intimacy, but it's secretly part of Modius's plan, his agenda to control the player character in question. Juggler shows up with his new child, Evelyn, for whom he didn't ask for permission from Modius to create. He's openly defying the prince's authority, and this is a point of tension in the scenario. And finally, a vampire from Chicago arrives with a message from Prince Loden of Chicago. Prince Loden considers Gary part of his domain and Modius his subordinate. This infuriates Modius, who asks the PCs to take his reply to Chicago. And then it just ends quite suddenly.
Yes.
So, Tom, let's talk about our bona fides here. How have you used this portion of Vampire the Masquerade?
So, yeah, I used this to run 2 sessions of Vampire the Masquerade recently, 2nd edition, and with a third sort of in the offing. We haven't quite wrapped up everything we wanted to, but yeah, 2 3-hour sessions we got from this. How about you?
I have not played it in recent years, but it was my introduction to Vampire the Masquerade, as I suspect it was for many, many people back in the 90s. Let's talk about things we liked. Everything I liked is basically just piggybacking off the stuff that you have written down, so
Okay.
why don't you kick us off here, Tom?
First off, I do like the adventure when we say adventure format, I think I'm referring to both parts, okay, the Forged in Steel and Baptism by Fire, because they don't really work without each other. But the format it's essentially a character-based sandbox, much like we discussed in the Warhammer adventure Power Behind the Throne. There's not like there are locations and backdrops, but ultimately the business of the adventure is deciding who you think is interesting and who you want to go talk to and make deals with and learn about, and then going and doing that. It's not like the only adventure that does that, but they're not that common, and it worked pretty well. It doesn't look like much. If you just listened to the summary and thought, well, this sounds a bit thin, well, it also appears a bit thin on the page, to be honest with you. But it really delivered for our game. It did generate these sort of, once it comes into contact with real people playing at the table, it did generate interesting events and happenings and emotional responses. And yeah, it was pretty good in that respect. It hews pretty closely to the stereotype that, well, I guess at the time they weren't stereotypes yet for Vampire the Masquerade, but you've got your sort of forlorn romantic toreadors and your violent bourgeois,
Right,
and
yeah.
so on. But to an extent, I think the game really needed this. This is what a generic basic vampire game looks like. And when they came to publish the revised edition in about, I think 2001, didn't have an example scenario. It had loads of clans,
Right.
and it had a huge chapter about storytelling and themes and kind of
Right.
railroading your players into doing stuff. But it didn't have rubber hits the road examples of what to do. I think it suffered from that at the time. So just in the sense of how it shows you how to set up the themes and ideas and basic characters of a NPC-driven sandbox, I think it's really valuable, and it did work out well. But what's your impression, and what, if anything, do you remember from playing it back in whenever?
I agree with you. I haven't played it in recent years, so I can't speak to its effectiveness, but its effectiveness seems fairly obvious from a read. It does come off a bit thin, but I played enough games to kind of know how it's going to go. I think it's really interesting because it's really, really good at what it's supposed to do, which, as you've said, is to sort of show people what Vampire the Masquerade is like. Here are the clans, and here are the tropes and the themes that this game deals with, and here's the sort of basic political intrigue gameplay. Here's the seduction aspect. It does a good job of showing like what Vampire is. Interestingly, I think that this module, we'll call it, say, has been essentially made obsolete by time and pop culture. At this point, everyone, even if you have only a passing understanding of Vampire the Masquerade, you know what is supposed to happen in Vampire. It's such an established thing, which has been reinforced by other pop culture things that deal with similar themes, like decadent vampire clans and all that stuff. But this is undeniably good at what it's supposed to do. There's lots of moments where basically the scenario is teaching you the rules of Vampire the Masquerade. And I don't mean like the mechanics. I mean like the rules of the setting.
No, it
right?
interestingly doesn't have a fight scene or anything like that.
Yeah, exactly
It's just
right.
telling you the setting, yeah.
It's just telling you the sort of rules of the setting, how the masquerade works, why we do the masquerade, what happens if you violate that, the blood bonding, like all that stuff, right? It does a good job of teaching the setting, teaching what the game is about in a way that seems fairly efficient. Now, here's the thing. You asked about my memory of it. I never super got into Vampire the Masquerade. I played it in high school, but I never really got into it. And I think that this module is why, because The type of gaming I was interested in doing back then was not this. I was interested in fights. I was interested in magic. I was interested in doing like all the cool shit. And this scenario actually penalizes you for doing the things that vampires are supposed to do. This scenario is straight up just talking to people, learning the politics, and maybe being sexy. When I was in the 8th and 9th grade, that just wasn't what I wanted to do, you know? And so I distinctly remember playing this and thinking, what is this? Like, this is not for me. Now, I was an idiot or just young. Nowadays, there's a lot of appeal here. I could see the appeal, I should say. Like, when adults were back in the 90s playing this, I get it. What are some of the things that you enjoyed about it?
The core of this, the real absolute, the diamond hard central nugget, is the cast of characters. I think the NPCs are good. They're not over the top. Well, with some exceptions, which is to their credit, and they do work well. So, I mean, first off, actually, let's do an art shout-out. We haven't mentioned the art, really, because this doesn't have a front cover, because it's only part of a book, but the Joshua Timbrook portraits are all in this kind of etching-like black and white style, so that it's all by the same artist, which is a good thing. Some of them are less good than others, but like they're all pretty stark, and they show a lot of the character. You can show these portraits to the players, and they get it. They get who they're talking to right away. And I like how they're messed up. Actually, Lucian and Danov, these two are quite boring because they're basically just plot point dispensers. Lucian is an elder who's kind of got his act together. He's pretty comfortable. He doesn't really want anything from the PCs. And Danov is the wanderer who's seeking enlightenment. And so he's sort of like a sage figure,
right?
Which can be interesting, but you wouldn't write a novel about that guy, you know.
Right, yeah.
However, everyone else... Evelyn has just been turned into a vampire at her request, which is noted somewhere. She bounds up to the PCs and introduces herself and starts asking about, what powers do you have? What clan are you in? So that lack of self-awareness, if anyone who's been paying attention for the first 20 minutes of the game will know, is going to get her destroyed at some point. Alicia has this tragic need for love, and of course she's bloodbound to Modius, which is like not exactly mind control, but certainly an unequal relationship. And Modius is, like, he would be sympathetic if he was less of a tool, but basically he's kind of a weak, vacillating figure who is then cruel. He punches down, basically. So he's definitely a villain, but he's such a pathetic one. It kind of, is confusing to know how to react to it, which is great because that's what you want in a game that's about reacting to NPCs. And they are thematically correct as well. The theme is decay, and almost all of them have just let things slide for too long. It's too late for them to fix their problems, basically. And they're going to drag the PCs into those problems because they are indecisive people who don't deal with issues, which is pretty good.
They're remarkably human, right?
Yeah.
I mean, all these characters, which I think is really, really great. You know, since we're doing NPC talk, it's actually very funny. The last few days, I've been kind of reckoning with this thing I said a long, long time ago on another podcast where I said I didn't like it when modules told you how to role play a character. Like they instructed you how to role play a character.
Yeah, I remember you giving a Trail of Cthulhu adventure some stick for that quite a while
I did,
back.
yeah. But my opinion has changed quite a lot, obviously, in the ensuing years. I literally write games that tell people how to play characters. And this came up just yesterday in another podcast I recorded, me basically eating crow on this, because this module does a really good job of like telling you in a fairly brief but thorough way how to roleplay each of these NPCs. And that's the kind of that sort of GM support that I like nowadays in games. And it's especially important for something that's so NPC driven, like a court crawl type scenario. You really want to know how to play these characters, how to make them distinct from each other. And I think that's something that the module does really well. It
is, because they're like about maybe 3-4 lines max each one, how to play it. And it's particularly vital in session 2 when I've, forgotten all the names of the NPCs and which one was which. And then at the table, I just look at it and go, oh, yeah, it's this one. Okay. Really good there. And they are surprisingly evocative. So that's kind of the issue. Like, they have pretty generic, roughly North American names. They're all white, I think. They're all kind of Anglo. And Evelyn, Alicia, Annabelle is the name of the vampire who shows up from Chicago later. That's kind of realistic. They're not going to have unusual names except for Juggler, who's a douche. You would think they would all blur into one. But in practice, I found they didn't. In session 2, I did the thing where the detective calls up or gets in touch with the vampires. He doesn't call up. It's the 90s. he has to get beeped and then do a landline. When he mentions his sister's name, Evelyn, now I was expecting this to like not register at all and have to remind them. As soon as I said that, the players went, "Oh my goodness, Evelyn, no way!" And they were like suddenly really into this plot line. And I don't know what the secret is, but you're right. I think it's that they're so human, that they have these flaws that even if they're not said out loud to the players, you can feel them in play. That really works. And another thing that's good is their connection to the mortal world, I think, is very important as well. There's all these little notes. This is something Vampire the Masquerade loses later on. They start being these kind of grand lords in castles who don't, they sort of inhabit a separate realm. You've got Modius using guys from the Dockers Union to do security at his party. The detective wants to help his sister. The vampires are a lot more vulnerable than they would later be. In maybe a modern day vampire thing, the servants at the party would all be 100% mind controlled. They'd basically be robots. But in this party, you actually have to keep the masquerade. By the way, have we explained to non-vampire nerds what that is? The masquerade, kids, is when you have to pretend that vampires aren't real.
Right.
In case the humans rise up and, Yeah, that's actually a thing. Even though I think they have been dominated, haven't they, to be docile.
Right. Yeah.
But even so, you got to watch out. And that's the thing I always, when I'm running vampire or related games, Monster Hearts, whatever, I always want to have this crossover between the two worlds, because that's when things get interesting, I think, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree completely. Okay, another thing that I think that this module in particular, but also Vampire the Masquerade as I know it has this emphasis on seduction and sex that you just don't see very often in role-playing games anymore. There are lots of good cultural reasons for this, and I also fully acknowledge that I'm saying this as a man who has never had to deal with sexual harassment at the game table, but I was struck at the unapologetic embrace of seduction and sexiness, and it's something that I think, especially now that we have much more refined tools in terms of like safety tools and conversations about boundaries and consent and play and things like that, I think there's a lot of room to sort of get back to that style of play for people who are interested in exploring it. That stuck out to me. I was curious if you had any thoughts on that, having played it recently.
To recap a bit in the scenario, what happens is Annabelle approaches one PC, or since I only had two players, I didn't want to leave one out, so I had her just approach both, and essentially take them upstairs to a bedroom and offer to share blood, which is the vampire equivalent of making out, or more than that. I don't know. It's basically the most intimate thing that vampires are interested in anymore. This was a bit of a leap of faith on my part. I was looking at that scene thinking, I'm not sure anyone's going to go for this, but I thought, well, let's see how it goes. And because it is, I think it's the best thing in the scenario. Like, the most vital thing is the cast of characters, because that's the dungeon map. But that scene is, it just worked incredibly well, especially because the two PCs had different opinions. One was like, no, this is too risky. What if we get caught? What if there's some side effect? Because they didn't, like, the players and vampire PCs didn't know too much about the mechanics at work here. And didn't have time to ask right now. The other character stroke player literally said the line, no, I want this. And so it's very powerful. Obviously, we drew a veil over things relatively early on. But, it's visceral. It's that vampires being both sexy and gross that we talked about when we discussed All of the Blood King. And it's also interesting, I think, that it's actually using specific mechanics or setting elements, the blood bond, in a way that's setting up future conflict at the same time as doing something interesting with the characters. So to sort of explain what's up with the blood bond, if you drink of another vampire's blood 3 times, I think, you're totally in love with them, like a charmed person.
Right.
But it's usually mutual. But because Alicia is the child of the prince, she's already bloodbound to him, and that can't be overwritten.
Right.
So it's one way. To give a D&D example, right, if you had a magic ritual that let you share hit points, that's kind of useful but not very interesting. But if it turns out later that sharing was only one way and you didn't realise, it suddenly becomes an interesting story. And the thing is, this information is available to the players if they think about the possibilities. And it was the difference between the two characters where one of them sort of had that in the back of their mind but didn't want to say it in front of anyone else. And then the impetuous one didn't care. And so it's great. It's character-driven play. It's weird and intimate, and there's blood everywhere. Yeah, it's really good. Just really, really powerful stuff.
That's awesome. Anything else we want to say about things we liked?
I just want to do a couple of scenario design technical notes. I want to say just about the right number of vampires, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Often in Vampire the Masquerade, in role-playing games in general, in vampire fiction, there are too many vampires. Anne Rice had sort of the opposite problem. She only had about 5 in the whole world. Right. I think 7 plus the PCs, which I think is what it is about right. Also, it brings in big secrets of the setting right away. Okay, so games of this era, mid to late 90s, 2000s, had a bit of a problem, as did I, as a relatively inexperienced GM, of wanting to save the good ideas for later. In this scenario, we have Danov talking about Golconda, the fact that you might be able to conquer your vampiric thirst forever. It's right here in the first session. He's willing to talk about it. And what I would have done when I was younger was go, oh no, I can't have that in session 1. I better save that for session 4. But there is no session 4 because everybody got bored of this stupid party where nothing happens.
Yeah.
So my top GMing and playing tip is do not save your good ideas for later. Use them right now. You will have more good ideas in the future, you know?
Exactly.
And that's what this does. Like, not in a very spectacular way, I have to say, but just the fact that it had these characters in the scene 2 telling you stuff about the setting is an example that I wish they'd highlighted more, because I had some real dreary longers of doing the vampire equivalent of grinding rats in the basement, which would have been avoided if we'd all just, at the time, accepted this idea that there is a medium in between throwing all the dirty secrets of the Black Hand Gonzo stuff in and the weirdly kind of restrained, we must never mention anything directly, which seemed to happen a lot. So yeah, that's good design, kind of at least seeding all these interesting backstory things right up front.
Let's go to questions we had. I only have a couple. The first is Michael. The character of Michael is, we'll say, neurodivergent, although not described in that manner in the text. No, he's not.
Although I believe, was that still current at the time? Might have been. But yeah, intellectually disadvantaged, I think, is maybe another. They use a lot of terms that I probably wouldn't, descriptions that I wouldn't use in the year 2021. Let's just put it that way. Yeah. I think the character can be played in a way that's not completely offensive like it is in the text. I'm curious how you handled Michael. To be honest, I did not have the dilemma because he's one of the kind of elements in the party scenario that's not introduced very well. He's standing by himself, ignoring people, looking scared. They didn't really bother going to talk. Yeah, they didn't really worry about it. But he's, I understand and broadly am sympathetic with the decision to include him. I think he is the trope of the unsuitable vampire.
Right.
Claudia, the little girl in Interview with the Vampire, the one who was he turned into a vampire through cruelty or a sort of spur of the moment wanting to be charitable but not really thinking through what was going to happen next? Because he's fundamentally, he doesn't, well, he survived so far, but everyone's feelings about him or opinion of him in the setting is that he doesn't have what it takes to keep living. So that's the thing. I think he's a very sad character, and
he's a sad, tragic character for sure. And in terms of the module's themes, the game's themes, I get the existence of the character. It makes a lot of sense to me. I just think that there can be a real touch and go role playing challenge there. Like depending on how you want to do that, you know. So anyway, maybe enough about that. Let's talk about, so I mentioned earlier, the module does just end quite suddenly. I'm curious what your group did afterwards, or have you yet done that?
Yeah, so we have, when I say I used it for 2 sessions, I used this material for, 6 hours, but the party was at most an hour and a half of that. But you're right, it ends suddenly. There's even a suggestion at the end, like, maybe you'll think you've done enough for this chronicle and end your campaign here. It's like, what? Who is going to go, we went to a party in a leaky mansion, talked to some guys, that was it. Good game, everyone. See you next time. I mean,
exactly. Yeah.
Nothing happens. It's like
nothing happens. There's no action.
It's Vampire Seinfeld. It's a scenario about nothing.
Vampires.
Yeah. But it gives you loads of stuff. But it's sort of on the storyteller, the GM, to make those NPC the things they want, to make it more pointed. To be fair, in the plan section, although it's easy to miss, it does sort of point out what's supposed to start happening. You know, you're meant to go to the party, then you sort of realise that the vampire hunter Sullivan Dane is around and maybe try and deal with him. And then sooner or later, the detective Evelyn's brother will contact someone. But the actual scenario gives you none of that. It gives you a little fetch quest, like take this letter to Chicago. Yeah, so it's a bit lacking there. What I ended up doing was Modius's offer was rather more pointed. So there's like a rule of thumb that give you in the vampire book. It's like 1 vampire for every 100,000 humans in a given area. Okay. And so I looked up the population stats for Gary, Indiana, and I had Modius deliver that information. So he just said to them, you're new. I've got you guys, so that's 2. I've got my child, she doesn't count. I've got 7 other vampires out there. The numbers don't add up. You're going to have to reduce that number by 2 if you want to stick around.
Yeah.
Of course, simultaneously, he was also planning to just have them offed. So on the way to Chicago, he essentially just had some cops stop their car. Not to necessarily arrest them, but because he knew they would do something that over the radio would tip off anyone who was listening and who knew about vampires what was up. And sure enough, one of the characters used her presence ability to overawe the cops. They ended up giving them a flashing lights escort into the city instead of arresting them for whatever traffic misdemeanor they were meant to have done. That was enough to kind of essentially give the vampire hunter who's around the information. And then, they went to Chicago, they tangled with random Sabat gang, the usual stuff, talked to various characters there. What else did they do? Yeah. Came back, Anyway, the point is they ended up with a Highlander-style fight at the dockyards, and one of the characters staked Modius, and we don't know what's going to happen next. So overall, it all kind of built out nicely because the very simple plot interacts in unpredictable ways with vampires' superpowers, right? This is the important thing. You're carrying a letter to Chicago, the police stop you, but you've got magic powers, and then weird stuff happens. You remember that you've got a mentor on your character sheet, so you go talk to your old university professor, and he helps you stake the Prince of Gary. That is the kind of thing that's really interesting, and lots of scenarios and players and GMs misguidedly try and stop it happening in Vampire, also in D&D, right? They'll do a thing like, the idea I had in my head doesn't work if someone can read auras, so I'll have a magic effect that cancels that superpower. Yeah. Don't do that, right? Have a cool story about someone who can see auras, and that's it. That's interesting. Again, it's similar to the don't save your good ideas. It's don't try and block things. Just let it be. See how that snowballs out of things. Yeah, that was what got interesting, the unpredictable nature of it. You've still got that bank of characters ready and waiting to use. It's pretty robust, and if you try and just make it about delivering a boring letter to the Prince of Chicago, that's not interesting at all. But letting things spiral out of control is interesting.
Awesome. Did you have any questions?
Could this have more mortal connections? Now, I think there's some good bits with how Modius... I always hate the thing when they have vampires who quote-unquote control the steel mills or the rail yards. What does that even mean, One thing I threw in is my classic, I have a scene I always do early on in vampire games, which is where, as long as they've been recently turned into a vampire, they bump into someone in the street who just knows them.
Yeah.
And it's great because it works if they engage with it or if they don't. So in this game, I had the Tremere. Her backstory was she'd been a sort of 50s housewife who got into the occult, and then the leader of the cult turned out to be a vampire. And she bumped into her son, who wasn't really sure if it was her because it's been 20 years, right? So she still looks the same, and he was too young to really remember. And that was a very interesting scene. But I've done it previously, and the character was like this Brujar who, his backstory was a bit, you'd eye roll it. He'd been a mafia enforcer, but now he's a Camarilla enforcer. But then that's the thing. So his reaction to meeting an ex-girlfriend walking her dog was like he was trying to tough guy it out. And that's even better in a way than actually reacting in a human way. Because it's very hard to be cool when, like a little terrier sniffing around your feet. So that's the kind of thing I would have liked to see more of, maybe.
Presumably you have just done character creation and you have to do the little prelude bit that you do in Vampire.
Yeah, a bit.
So you do get some look at the mortal world, at least. I don't know. I think it's probably sufficient.
It probably is, actually, yeah. Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. Let's go to the chain lightning round. Tom.
Quote, "The characters and the other vampires of Gary are likely to become allies of convenience. Therefore, the storyteller must cultivate a dislike for Chicago in the players."
I like that we're told that Modius's sound system at the party is Bose. The 90s kid in me understands why this detail is included, because back then Bose was very high end.
Yeah. Bang & Olufsen. Similarly, I like the shabbiness of Modius's mansion. Like, it's full of fine art and high-end party supplies and fancy champagne, but there are buckets on the floor to catch the drips from the ceiling.
That's so good. I like this advice, re-hunting mortals. Quote, you won't always want to spend much time on such scenes, but the first one at least should be fairly detailed and evocative. That's great RP advice. That's great GMing advice. The first time you do the thing that the characters are elementally known to do should be the best time.
Yes, absolutely. And another quote, Alicia knows little of vampire lore and does not realize what she is actually being used for. She shares blood because she is desperate for love of any sort, and even more importantly, for the beauty which has fled her life.
And I am going to say the illustration on page 259 is pretty terrific. It's a pair of vampires, horizontal orientation, very excitedly, jovially looking each other's eyes as they grasp each other. It's a great, energetic
Yeah, it's full of verve, isn't it? It's great, yeah.
Yes, indeed. Let's go to the Expert Delve. It's the Expert Delve. Tom, this is your Expert Delve. I'm pinging off you, so get us started. What's going on?
Okay, cool. So this Expert Delve is about buying into and taking a certain genre or mood on its own terms.
Yes.
And not being ironic. Maybe that's the thing. The Expert Delve is about not being ironic. So this stems from, before we started playing Vampire, I was talking to the potential players who might show up and do it. And one of the questions I got, because some of the players are a lot younger and don't really know about Vampire. In fact, much of the conversation went, "Oh, we play the vampires. Oh, that's interesting." And I was like, "Oh, I feel so old at this point." Okay. So one player said, "Yeah, if we're playing the vampires, is it a bit like what we do in the Shadow situation, or is it a serious period fantasy?" And now this is a very legit question, right?
It is, yeah.
My reply was, and I'll quote myself because I've got it copied here. In my experience, you're often only one line of dialogue away from being in what we do in the Shadows, and it's a good idea to just let that happen sometimes. But honestly, the best experiences are when you accept the gothic punk world on its own terms and play it straight.
Right.
I think that's true. I said it back in 1997 deliberately to just embrace all that. Gotta stop saying the word embrace in a podcast about vampire, but just accept the idea that leather jackets and sunglasses after dark are cool, that Skunk Anansi is a valid musical choice for doing anything, or this kind of thing. And yeah, my sort of thesis statement is that I think it's often rewarding to take things more seriously than they maybe really deserve. Sports, if you analyse what you're doing, are almost universally pretty dumb. Decorative handicrafts, a bit pointless, growing tiny trees. But these are all things that are actually worth... There's the idea, anything's worth doing well. And Vampire the Masquerade is a very obvious example because of how it's a pretty arch, borderline camp proposition as a concept. Yeah. But this also applies to D&D, classic Western fantasy. There's a lot that's easy to parody, but it's also really rewarding if you don't do that. I will add a caveat though, there's a reason there's a phrase, taking things too seriously. Okay, so what we're talking about here is not being a jerk about getting it right and knowing the model number of the Millennium Falcon or whatever, but about putting in real thoughtfulness and effort. Yeah, maybe in prep, but mostly at the table, giving it your undivided attention. What's your initial reaction to this, Jason?
I have so many thoughts on this. So many. I shall try to give you the best ones. Okay,
try and keep it brief, yeah.
Remember when we talked about horror role-playing games? I talked about how you should approach the trappings of the genre with a certain degree of earnestness, even going so far as to setting mood lighting and things with candles and whatnot. I feel like this is in the same spirit as this conversation. It's a little bit more of an out-of-character consideration, but I think that role-playing games, especially very genre things that you're doing, you really do have to kind of take them on their own terms, and you really do have to embrace what the genre is doing and doing your best, there's that word again, to sort of embrace it, right? So that's kind of my initial thinking, but I also think that it depends so much on what the game is about. It depends a lot on the mechanics of the game. It depends on whether it does have this underlying camp thing that Vampire sort of does have. I think about the tone conversation when you're doing, like, say, Cats or a similar procedure before the game. I think this is really where you want to make sure you talk about that. Say, okay, this is sort of the tone of the game. This is what we should do. And I think it's really important in play, and maybe even when you're having that conversation, to make it really clear that sometimes the way we treat the story as players is maybe not going to be totally serious, or we're going to like have a laugh about something every now and then, but that the characters in the story are dead serious about what they're doing. I think this is the power of the medium, if I'm being honest, like that you can have this separation. And I think it's something that you can control at the table as long as you're really clear about what the expectation is. So in my game, Brindlewood Bay, the tone portion of Cats says, the tone of this game bounces between the cozy and the creepy. Most of the time it will be fairly lighthearted, but occasionally it will get very dark and menacing. This is the key bit. Some kitschy, campy humor is permissible here, and very much in keeping with some of the game's inspirations, which is genre TV shows. But above all, your characters should take everything they do very seriously, even if we're having a bit of a laugh from time to time. Do your best to maintain the tone. Sometimes you're not going to, and that's okay. But make sure your characters are at least being authentic and honest to the story.
That's really kind of dynamite in-play advice, because, of course, there's two extremes that often mess this up, right? There's the not taking it seriously at all. D&D's so wacky. The crazy hijinks we have. Yeah, whatever, kids. But
basically
also
all
there's
5e culture.
Yeah, exactly. Guys, just yeah, we get it. So, but also there's the other one. There's that sort of, there was a bit of a trend, this sort of, if anyone laughs during your game of Call of Cthulhu, you failed, which is, but that doesn't, if you set such exacting standards for yourself, it's impossible, right? Someone's accidentally.
It's impossible. You're probably not having fun. It's probably a symptom, honestly.
But of course, I remember that horror conversation. I wasn't saying skeptical about your mood lighting and music thing. I was just thinking, I don't think any of the groups I've played with would be able to handle that. They would just...
That's skepticism.
It's too much skepticism. I think so. There's a question of be as earnest as is possible. So because actually, one of the things that makes me think this is a good idea, because we did experience this at the table as well, is it's similar to what I think is one of the things that's fun about going to the theatre. There's borderline ridiculousness, okay?
Okay, yeah.
You are aware when you're in the audience that you're watching a guy, like it's in the back of your head, right? You're watching a guy delivering, actually, is it a soliloquy in Macbeth? The distinction is not important, but one person delivering a speech. They are on a razor-thin line between too much acting and too little. Right. When they're on that line, he's Hamlet, Tragic Prince of Denmark. A little bit either way, and he's just some guy in tights who really better have a good sword fight at the end of this, because this play is super long, and you've got things to do. That's what's actually fun about it. It's sort of simultaneously you're immersed in the moment of this character who's come to life for you, but in the back of your head there's also that thrill of this could go wrong at any second.
Right, yeah.
But the idea that you can have a general direction, but you don't have to enforce it with an iron fist, I think is really good insight. And I have a theatre anecdote to back this up. So I once went to a production of Macbeth with a friend of mine, and early on there was a moment where everyone in the cast and the audience realised just for a second that one of the lines is pretty funny, if you think about it. It's actually the bit where Lennox talks about how there's like a howling gale, and I think the horses were biting each other in the stables and all this kind of apocalyptic omen stuff. And Macbeth's reply is, yeah, it was a rough night. And the trouble was, once that switch had been flipped, you keep spotting more jokes, spoiler alert for Macbeth, everyone, but when Banquo's ghost shows up at the dinner, and so everyone's looking at Macbeth, he seems to be seeing things, this man's lost his mind, and Lady Macbeth quote unquote reassures them by saying, don't worry about it, he's often like this. That's that doesn't help. Right. But because the cast kind of joined in with this, and this is where this becomes relevant to role-playing, they didn't fight against it. They didn't go, oh, no, this is a very serious play. No laughing, basically. They went with it, and they gradually guided it back so that when you get to Act 4... Wait, how many acts are in Macbeth? When you get to the final act, we're back in the serious, exciting stuff. Right. And that worked really well. And I think, as you say, that works in role-playing games. Sometimes
it goes back to expectation setting, right?
Yeah.
Going back to another Cats thing, another tone thing in another one of my games in the between. My quote here in the text is, The tone of the Between is dark, mysterious, and sensual. A little bit of levity or humor from time to time is okay, but we will always strive to return to that dark, brooding place the characters exist in. I love this bit of the text, and it's probably one of the most effective things I've ever written for a game, because what it does is it gives permissions all over the place. It says, you have permission for levity and humor, but we have permission as a group to say, okay, let's get it back to where we need to be. And it's sort of everyone's responsibility. It's not just the GM's responsibility, right? I think that that's really the key with this. The medium of role-playing games is fascinating because it is a group of people getting together with all their own ideas, their own thoughts, their own biases, their own experiences, and their own like inputs that they're bringing into the story. And you're all coming together as a group, and you are collectively making a story out of all of that, using the module or the game or whatever as your foundation. And the possibility for it to go in wild, unforeseen directions is a strength of the medium. It's also a danger of the medium, because that wild direction, it might step on someone else's fun, right? It might step on my idea of what the story should be. You really have to have permission, whether that's from the game or from however the GM presents things, to rein it in, as needed.
Yeah, and actually, as a sort of practical at the table tip, one thing I noticed, in this vampire game, also recently I've been running quite a bit of Apocalypse World and things like that, where it's useful to be able to move everyone back off the sidetrack. It's actually okay for someone to become the tone police for a second, or become the boss, and rein things in and say, okay, everyone, we've all had a great time, but let's get back to what we're doing. I mean, personally, I've felt reluctant to do that, to take on that temporary role sometimes, because I think, well, I'm not the boss here, why should I? But actually, it's okay. People don't mind. They'll just go, you're right, we should stop, let's go do the thing. Don't be a jerk about it. Don't be kind of, no witticisms, come on, we're doing this only. But don't be afraid to occasionally go, okay, maybe let's go do the adventure. It's fine. Nobody will be upset, usually. I think,
anybody who would be upset about someone saying, hey, let's kind of get the tone back on track, let's get the story back on track, anybody who would get mad about that is probably somebody you shouldn't be playing with. Like, I'm just trying to imagine the sort of person who would respond negatively to that. And it's probably the kind of person who you just don't want at the table, if I'm being honest. That's so, maybe put that in your back pocket for the future.
Keep that one in mind. I'd also like to sort of build on something you mentioned about people's different ideas of what the game's going to be. Because one of my things that I noticed and thought about during playing Vampire again for the first time in is it 20 years? No, it's not 20 years. It's less than that, thank God. And especially I think this applies to like gothic punk stuff, or maybe to Between as well, things where your characters are cool. I think a good tip is to give positive feedback. You're not here to entertain other people. You're here to feel cool while you're talking about your cool character. Exactly. So you should enjoy doing that, doing things you think are cool. And when other people do things, I would say roll with it. Are on the side of accepting their idea of coolness, even if maybe inside that's not what you would have done.
It's not your idea of cool,
which is basically why the different clans in Vampire exist. So, but give a positive feedback, just like an appreciative nod when they talk about something, or literally go, huh, that's cool. I think that really just helps. Like
goes a long way. Yeah, it really does.
Yeah, it's great.
I think whenever you're playing a role-playing game, you're always looking for anything that helps sync up the various headcanons. Anything that helps cross that bridge between the players is great. And one of the ways you can do that is through positive reinforcement. And, I mostly play online, and I always say, before I start with a new group at least, make your approval really dramatic on screen. Like, nod very vigorously, smile widely.
Yeah. I've seen people give thumbs ups during play, which is sometimes a bit confusing, but once you get into it, it's okay.
And it's because you want to, I think sometimes we take for granted that it is a lot to have the spotlight on you, to be expected to speak in character, to be expected to, maybe in my games, to describe the scene as well, like your part-time GM as well, and to essentially entertain people, right? Like, it's a big ask. It's something that you don't have to do in any other kind of hobby, right? Like, there are no other hobbies that require you to be, at this precise moment, responsible for everyone else's fun in this way. And so, anything you can do to kind of affirm is really good. And getting kind of back to the topic of leaning into the genre, or taking things seriously or at face value, accepting them on their terms. That's a big part of that, right? Because it's like, did I do gothic horror good? Yes, you did.
Yeah.
Did I do the seduction part good? Yes, you did. That's part of it. Anything else you want to say about this?
No, I think we've covered it pretty well. Just my concluding thought is that everybody's wrong. The 90s were cool, and Sunglasses After Dark are awesome.
Very good. Let's go to the next segment. It's the companion adventures. All of my picks are NPC role-playing inspiration picks.
Oh, cool. Yeah, let's do that first.
Yeah, so I'll start with that. I don't have one for every character, and I have some that I'm actually changing on the fly here. But
okay.
We'll see how it goes. For Modius, I'm going to go with the Duke in Moulin Rouge, the 2001 musical. That character's a little broad, but I think that dialing it in just a bit, I think that's a great, great depiction of this weakling character who still has a lot of power and people are still deferential to them, even though they're like kind of a chump. So I like that a lot. For Alicia, I think the very obvious choice here is May in Near Dark.
100%, yeah.
I don't know if there's a better choice. I mean, Alicia probably was inspired by May in Near Dark.
Yeah.
The Juggler, I think, is Severin in Near Dark, 1987 vampire movie. Michael, I don't know. I've got thoughts, but I'm just going to leave it. Evelyn, lots of choices here. I've been going back and forth on Evelyn, like 20 different options, because this is kind of a tropey character. I was initially thinking pretty much any Helena Bonham Carter role. I was thinking Jessica Walter's character in Play Misty for Me from 1971 is not a bad choice because that's a character who's very assertive. I have no business being in your house right now, but I'm here and I'm like inserting myself into your life. I think I'm actually going to go with the more straightforward choice, which is Nancy from The Craft. I think Nancy from The Craft is like a good archetype for Evelyn. Danov, not the most interesting character in the scenario, but I think Tom Noonan in most things, but especially Manhunter, for the sort of tall, creepy, silent type. I had a lot of thoughts on Lucian. I didn't write anything down, but I kind of was feeling like Ciaran Hinds in a lot of stuff. Because he's older, like serious, gravitas. Yeah,
maybe Yearman, what's his name? Brian something? He's the general in X-Men, isn't he?
Oh, yes. Is that... I don't remember. I know what you're talking about, though. For all the cops and normal people, I was thinking just like the cast of LA Confidential.
Yes. Or To Live and Die in LA, something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Just any of the characters from those, I think would be great. Annabelle, who is the vampire from Chicago, I didn't come up with like a particular like role here, but I really just envisioned them as like a Laura Dern type.
The illustration actually looks a bit like...
The illustration does look a lot like Laura Dern, actually. So that's my stuff for this week.
Okay, great. Well, let me see. I have some music and film. Well, the music is the YouTube playlist that I very strictly created based on what was available on New Year's Day 1997, but with a kind of vampire theme, Yeah, I'll put a link to that in the show notes, the fabled link in the show notes.
Right.
What else? And then for film, two things. So there's The Crow from 1994. That's for just the look and feel, the gothic punk world of Vampire the Masquerade.
Dead-ass 90s stuff, exactly. Right?
Then from the same year, actually, Interview with the Vampire, also 1994. What a year for gothy cinema.
We have some synergy going on that year, right? Like it was a thing.
And then so that, I think, is your go-to for the big emotions of Vampire the Masquerade of this thing.
Child,
It also has the character Claudia, played by Kirsten Dunst, who is, like Michael, is the unsuitable vampire, the one that shouldn't survive. And she also has a bit of Evelyn in her. Yeah. From how excited she is by her powers when she gets them, So those are two good touchstones, I think.
Yeah. Well, listeners, that's Fear of a Black Dragon. If you want to get in touch with us, you can do so on Twitter at GauntletRPG. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. We have a Patreon. If you'd like to support the show financially, it's patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. And thanks to our Inconnu editor, Rich Rogers. And thank you, listeners, for listening.
Take care.
Goodbye.
Listeners, we want to let you know that Hearts of Woolen, our PBTA game of wuxia melodrama, is now available as a PDF on DriveThruRPG. Hearts of Woolen emulates films like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon and Shadow, and TV series like The Untamed and Ancient Detective. It is inspired by the Chinese martial arts novels of Jin Yong and Gu Long and their many adaptations. In these tales, romance is as dangerous as a blade. You can buy Hearts of Woolen at the Gauntlet store on DriveThruRPG. You can find more information and resources for it on our Gauntlet blog, on the Gauntlet webpage at gauntlet-rpg.com.